Today is May 20th. We are a couple of months into the current pandemic, and hopefully everyone is well, and we're excited for our presentation today. I want to start off with a big thank you to Templeton Demographics for hopping on and sharing with us some of the trends in the marketplace right now, and maybe what some of the impacts of the COVID-19 are to our industry. Real quickly, we want to start with a couple of just chapter announcements. Quickly, the agenda you can see there. Just a quick update, Southern Region update. Hopefully everyone received an email about the rescheduling of the Southern Region Conference to September 16th through September 18th. Still in Fort Worth. A couple of quick things to note: that if you were already registered, your registration automatically transferred. If you need to move your registration to another person, that can be done. Just contact Donna with the organization, and all that can happen. Housing's open, sponsorships are open, so be aware of that and get signed up if you're interested. We do have coming up the chapter planning retreat in July. We had a board meeting before this meeting to do some pre-planning on that. We're excited about what the future looks like, as it is going to look probably a little different for us through the fall. And so you'll be hearing more about what our programs will look like and things like that as we look to the fall and the future of our organization. The last thing I want to speak on from update is just highlight some of the new members. We have several Corgan members that are first-time members of the organization, and so as you can see their names there, just want to give a shout out to them and say thanks for being a part of the organization. We look forward to engaging you and you being an active participant in the organization. So you'll see next month we are going to do a little brief summary of corporate memberships to make sure everybody's aware and understanding of the way the organization has adjusted corporate memberships. And so we hope that maybe it makes sense for you to look at a different level and be able to add a few more members from your organization to be members of A4LE. Programs update. Obviously today we're doing our Zoom webinar with Templeton. Our next program is scheduled for June 17th in Mansfield ISD. You'll be seeing some more information on that. We anticipate that to be a virtual meeting. We're not exactly sure what that program is going to look like, but please be on the lookout for an email from A4LE or through our social media channels on the upcoming program on June 17th. Membership update. As you can see the numbers there, we're still holding strong. And again, thank you to all of our members for hanging in there with us and continuing to be a part of our organization. I think we're up to 60 or 70 people on this virtual call today, and so thanks again for everybody's participation. Again, follow us on social media, and like all of our past programs, this program is being recorded and will be something we're able to share with you after the meeting. And Templeton's been gracious enough to share their presentation with us for future reference for those that are partaking, as well as other membership. Fundraising update. One thing that's changed since our last meeting is we were fortunate enough to be able to add BRW and Rulon International as silver sponsors. And so thank you to BRW and Rulon for stepping up as corporate sponsors for the year. Just want to say thanks for supporting the organization. So shout out to BRW and Rulon International. We do have 2 sponsorships remaining at the silver level. And so if you're interested in becoming a silver sponsor, reach out to myself or Tanya Cottle with Glenn Partners for more information. Emerging Professionals, our 20 under 40 initiative at the Southern Region level. There's going to be an event that's held at the Southern Region Conference that's now been moved to September, so be on the lookout for more information there. And then our May bowling event, which was actually scheduled for tomorrow, has been rescheduled to August 20th. And so be on the lookout for more information there. We all hope to be back to a more normal state, but we've moved that obviously with the current situation, and hope we'll have good participation come August. And then those are some of the points I made earlier on the Southern Region Conference rescheduling. Again, looking forward to a great conference and a lot of fun things that I know they were working on or going to continue to work on to make that conference great for those that can attend. Okay, before we get started with Templeton's program, I want to just talk through a couple of logistical housekeeping items. This webinar feature has a Q&A feature, and so Sangeetha is on the call with us as a panelist, but what her role will be monitoring those Q&A, those questions that come in. So as Bob's presenting today, if you have a question about something that he presents, please use that Q&A feature to ask your question, and Sangeetha will be tracking those throughout the presentation, and then at the end we'll have some time to be able to respond to those questions. Sangeetha will ask the questions and then give Bob a chance to respond. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Bob, to share your screen and your presentation, and then we'll get started.
Well, good afternoon, Jordan. Thank you for allowing me to present today. Hopefully you are seeing my PowerPoint presentation. Can you give me confirmation that I have shared the correct screen?
Yes, the Great Lockdown is on. If you want to click the presentation, it'll go full screen for us.
Okay, how about now?
If you go up top to the display settings on the presenter view.
Okay, let's see.
Click that and then say swap. Yep, do that one. There we go, ready to rock and roll.
Okay, very good. Well, once again, good afternoon. Jordan, thank you for allowing me to present today. These are incredibly historic times. I've labeled this the Great Lockdown. And it's an event that's unlike any event in history that we've seen. It's a shock to the world that was a result of this pandemic, and it has created a spring that is truly like no other spring that we've ever seen. In fact, just a couple of months ago, we were preparing for spring break. Many school districts were already in the middle of spring break when we saw this sudden shift. It did require school districts to move to virtual learning across the country. And also we saw this shift to working from home. So we've seen a tremendous shift to work from home. Learning has moved to online learning. It's created this shift that's truly historic in that, you know, commuting has gone away. Airport travel has been drastically reduced. It has been a shock to the world that has affected several different areas. In fact, it was just a couple of months ago, we were seeing historic highs for job growth in the state of Texas. We were very fortunate that we had 4 cities in the top 20 cities in the country for job growth. In fact, Dallas-Fort Worth had been in the top 2 or 3 spots every quarter for the last 8 years with positive job growth. Houston has bounced around just a little bit because of their dependence on energy. So we had seen Houston kind of bounce around, but back in February, Houston was at the about the 6th spot in the country, and then Austin and San Antonio were down at 14th and 18th respectively for job growth. We were also seeing some historic unemployment rates. You know, this graph just shows you what the unemployment rates have been for the major cities in Texas going back to December of 2004. We had a little bit of a bump in 2009 and 2010. Of course, that was during the Great Recession. And then we had literally about 9 years of pretty consistent growth in the economy. Those unemployment rates were well below 4% as of December. In fact, Austin was at 2.4, Dallas 2.9, Houston 3.6, and San Antonio was at 2.8. That was literally just a couple of months ago that we were seeing these low unemployment rates. And we were also seeing very strong home construction. In fact, not only did we have the top cities in the country for job growth, but we also had the top cities in the country for new home construction. Dallas was leading the way, DFW, at about 35,000 annual new home starts. Houston was second at about 30,500 annual starts. Austin was seventh at about almost 19,000 starts, and San Antonio was at 10th. So you get the picture. The state of Texas was in a very strong position in terms of its economic growth and economic outlook when we started 2020. January and February were two of the strongest months that we had ever seen for new home construction across the state. And then the great lockdown happened. This graph really kind of paints a pretty good picture, and it's a graph of the unemployment rates, and it goes all the way back to 1950. You can see the different recessions that happened. You know, back in the 70s, it was the oil embargo, which caused gasoline prices to skyrocket. And then in the 80s, we kind of had the double whammy, which some have dubbed that as the Reagan recession. And that's back when we saw inflation skyrocket. We saw the interest rates go up incredibly high, which did have an impact on the economy. And then in the early 90s, we had the savings and loan recession. In the early part of the 2000 decade, we had the dot-com crash, the Great Recession housing crash. And then in March of 2020, the great lockdown or the COVID pandemic recession. And it's likely going to turn into, you know, a marker in history that literally will go back to the Great Depression. And the unemployment rate is estimated to be at about 16%. They think that it could get as high as 20% over the next few weeks. And the kind of good news related to that recession is a majority of those lost jobs are furloughed jobs that when we get back to some form of normal in our work patterns, a lot of those jobs are going to come back. This just looks at the unemployment claims, and you can see, you know, it's a weekly look at the unemployment claims. And there again, it shot up toward the end of March. April was record-breaking months or weeks for unemployment claims. We're well over 33 million people that have filed for unemployment. Of course, that's greater than the state of Texas's population. Now, the biggest impacts by sector would be leisure and hospitality, which is the restaurant industry. It's also the travel industry, it's the entertainment industry. So leisure hospitality did have the biggest hit on the job losses. And, you know, construction, trade, transportation, utilities, you know, healthcare did see a little bit of a hit on that. You see the education and health, which is very unusual to have health care areas being impacted. That's due to the restriction on elective surgeries that went into effect when we first went into the pandemic. And then it also affected dental, it affected dermatology, chiropractic care, you know, all those areas that fall into that healthcare area did have to shut down in the early portions of this pandemic. Now, I mentioned that it had a major impact on the restaurant, leisure, hospitality industry. This graph is just showing you the change in retail sales. And you can see the drastic drop that happened in retail spending in March and in April. And the pandemic is causing a little bit of an acceleration of some trends. You know, retail was already getting a significant hit from the advancement of online spending, Amazon spending. And so we were seeing some changes in retail spending related to internet shopping. Well, the pandemic is accelerating those trends. You know, we're already hearing about bankruptcy filings from JCPenney. Many of the other major retailers are likely going to follow suit. It will likely see several weeks of news with retail fallout from the pandemic impact. Of course, another way to look at this data is restaurants. And of course, you know, some restaurants have been able to provide curbside options, to-go options. here's a map based on the Open Table Network, and you can see what happened. I mean, restaurant dining actually went to, zero, 100% drop in retail or restaurant dining. Now, over the last couple of weeks, some of the states there that are listed, Arizona, Texas, Alabama, did begin to see some opening of restaurant options. And so we've had a little bit of movement back, but you can see we're still a long way from where we were back in, early March. One of the other major impacts was in travel. And of course, the airline industries are getting hit exceptionally hard. That's going to be somewhat problematic for the Dallas-Fort Worth region due to our, we've got American Airlines headquarters, Southwest Airlines, and this graph is showing you the number of travelers that are passing through TSA checkpoints. Back in early March, it was somewhere between 2 to 2.5 million were the checkpoint travelers going through TSA checkpoints, and you can see it has dropped down significantly down to below, 500,000 checkpoint travelers through those TSA checkpoints. Another way we're tracking that is through commercial flights tracked by Flight Trader 24. And it's a very similar pattern that we're seeing, back prior to the COVID impact, we were at 100 to 115,000 commercial flights tracked daily. And it has swung down below 40,000, and we're starting to see a little bit of movement back up in air travel. But I do think this is one of the trends that COVID-19 has causing a reversal in. Reversal in travel related to airlines is likely going to be sustained for a longer period of time, just due to some changes that we're going to see in work patterns. Now I wanted to give you a little bit, the impacts are different across the country. This slide, we're looking at 4 different graphs or 4 different maps over 4 different points in time. You can see the top left chart number 1 was the unemployment rates in February. And you can see a majority of the country, the unemployment rates were below 4%. We had, a handful of states where the unemployment rates were up in that 4 to 8% range. Louisiana, Mississippi, New Mexico, Arizona, and some of those around the Ohio area, we had unemployment rates in that 4 to 8%, but the rest of the country was, at very low unemployment rates, below 4%. Then chart number 2 maps the initial change from the COVID impact as of March the 21st. You can see we had a nationwide jump in the unemployment rates. There again, the most negatively impacted were Nevada, Hawaii, Louisiana, Pennsylvania. Those states saw the biggest hit. Not surprisingly, Nevada and Alaska, Hawaii, those are related to travel. Now, Alaska's is related to energy. And then you can see again in chart number 3, a continued spread of the increase in the unemployment rates. And then chart number 4 kind of also tells that picture. Once again, those states that have a high concentration of leisure, hospitality, tourism, that's where we're seeing a pretty significant increase on those unemployment rates. Now, what's unfortunate for Texas and Houston is seeing a double whammy in that not only is it suffering from the impacts of COVID-19, but just poor timing altogether. The energy sector is getting hammered. What initially started was a kind of a supply issue between the OPEC nations and Russia. So there was an oversupply that was happening. And then when we went into the COVID-19 pandemic, caused a drastic drop in usage of energy. So our consumption dropped significantly, which then compounded the oversupply problem, which then resulted in a drastic drop in the barrel of oil price. In fact, futures actually went negative for a period. And prior to the COVID-19, oil was trading at about $60 a barrel. And somewhere around $50 a barrel is what is needed to maintain the state of Texas's budget area. You can also see on the graph the rig counts, and rig counts have dropped significantly. In fact, in a survey of oil executives, it is expected that 51% of the oil executives believe there is going to be a decrease in employment. So there is going to be job loss related to energy. Now trying to turn the story a little bit and looking at Texas enrollment patterns across the state of Texas. So this is the enrollment data that we get from TEA. It tracks all the enrollment in Texas schools. It does include the charter school enrollment. You can see Texas year over year has had very strong enrollment growth. In fact, this past October, enrollment growth had climbed to about 5.49 million students enrolled in Texas schools. We've got over 1,000 school districts that make up the school districts in Texas. Those darkest green shaded school districts are school districts that have the highest amount of enrollment growth. And then I've got a graph there on the bottom that tracks enrollment change by year. And you'll notice that between 2009 and 2014, we had been growing about 80,000 kids a year. And then we saw the rate of growth slow between 2015 and 2018, and it had dropped down to about 32,000 in October of 2018. In October of 19, we saw a very significant increase in the rate of growth. We jumped up to 62,000 students of growth this past October of 19. Now we track the enrollment growth, and we also look at the birth rate data. And this is a graph of the Texas birth rates going back to 1990. The red line is the birth rate. And you'll notice that we've seen some pretty significant drops or reductions in the birth rate. One of those drops started in 2007. And that was, when we were in that recessionary period, we actually thought that the drop in birth rate was originally tied to the recession. But then what we noticed was when we came out of the recession, we really did not see an increase in the birth rate. What we began to realize was the drop in the birth rate was related to new patterns of millennials. The millennials are about ages 23, 24, up to about their mid-30s now. And the millennials have had a different pattern in forming households, in marrying, in moving out of the house, and in having children. And so that drop was not a function of the economy. It was just a new function of the millennial behaviors. And so we are starting to see a little bit of an increase, but overall, this graph also tells that story. When we look at some trends on birth rates going back to the 1990s, the early 1920s, you can see the peak of the baby boomers back in the early 1960s. And then right now, we're still seeing that the birth rate is going to continue to stay down, because what we're also seeing is a change in patterns by age group. This map is showing us those birth rates by the different age groups for women. And some of this is related to improvements in birth control and the accessibility of birth control. So no doubt that is playing a significant role in the changes in the birth rates. There's only one category, one age group where we're seeing an increase in the birth rate, and that's the 35 to 39. That age section for women is increasing, but the others are decreasing. So we're continuing to see lower birth rates for those millennial women. Now, going to jump to back to some enrollment trend patterns, and we're looking specifically at Region 10 and Region 11. The darkest red school districts are school districts that have the highest amount of enrollment growth. What you'll notice from this pattern is that a majority of the growth is taking place in the northern portion of the DFW Metroplex. So North Tarrant County, Denton County, Collin County, those are the areas of the region where we see the highest amount of enrollment growth. It also kind of tracks very closely to where we see the highest concentration of job growth and where we're seeing the highest concentration of new home construction. So Region 10 and Region 11 enroll more than 1.3 million students in public schools. And within these two regions, more than 13,500 students in the last 5 years were added. And this year, this is a 5-year growth rate of 5.6%. The population for the DFW region actually exceeds about 7.5 million persons in 2019, and more than 1.2 million residents were added since 2010. So definitely the DFW region is the fastest growing region in the state of Texas. It's outpacing Houston. It's also outpacing Austin and San Antonio, even if you put those two regions together. Now, looking at these trends by school district, no surprise here, Frisco has been the fastest growing school district in the DFW region. Between 2014 and 2019, we saw an increase of about 13,000 students in Frisco ISD. Now, Prosper is fast becoming the new #1 district in the DFW region. So during that same period, they grew from 7,000 students to over 16,000 students. And look at that 5-year percentage of growth. Their percentage of growth is 138% during that 5-year period. No doubt Prosper ISD is one of the fastest growing school districts in the country based on percentage of growth. Now jumping over to Region 11, Northwest ISD is the fastest growing school district in Region 11. It's that north of Fort Worth area between Fort Worth and Denton. It's a very large geographic district. They added about 5,200 students in that 5-year period between 2014 and 2019. That was about a 26% growth rate. Denton is next at about 14% growth of about 3,800 students. Eagle Mountain, Saginaw, Mansfield, Burleson, Keller. Now Keller is dropping down the list just because they are running out of vacant land. So it's not a function of the desirability of the district, it's a function of vacant land. Now, one of the benefits that we have at Templeton Demographics is we are affiliated with Metro Study and Myers Housing Research. So we are literally tracking 90% of the single family construction across the country. And we immediately began to reach out to builders to get a sense of how they were responding to the pandemic, what were their observations, how do they see their plans going forward. And when we interviewed the builders, 69% of the builders that we interviewed felt like that they were going to be able to achieve 80% of their 2020 plan. So a significant majority of the builders believe that they are going to achieve at least 80% of the plan. Now there are, a few, less than, 15% believe that they could achieve between 60 to 20% of the plan. So overall, the builders do remain somewhat optimistic. Now, remember, we had the strongest January and February for new home starts that we've seen in the last several years. Now, one thing we are seeing is, and this is kind of creating a really unusual dynamic. When the pandemic hit, this is a graph of Redfin listings of existing homes. So that blue line represents the new listing patterns of existing homes for sale. The blue line is 2019 and the red line is 2020. So you can see we had a very normal start to the year for January and February. In fact, early March, we were following a very normal pattern for new or existing home listings for sale. And then when the pandemic started, we saw a drastic reduction or a pulling off of the market of existing homes for sale. I'm sure that was partially due to not wanting to have people tracking through their homes during the pandemic. So this sheltering in place caused a drop in the existing home supply of homes for sale. Now that's good news for new home builders. So their inventory of homes actually were very desirable during the start of the pandemic. So we began to look at the inventory of new homes across the major regions in Texas. And this is the new home inventory for new homes across the state of Texas by major region. You'll notice in Dallas-Fort Worth, the new home inventory of homes for sale is 21,796. Now that seems like a really large number, but keep in mind, those are homes that are under construction. Those are some finished vacant homes. They're also model homes. And what we have also heard from the builders is they've seen a very low cancellation rate from their homes that are under contract. So the buyers or the families that have put homes under contract to build, the cancellation rates have been very, very low. You'll notice in Austin, that's about 11,300. San Antonio's about 8,480 inventory. And Houston's about 18,600. Now, I mentioned earlier that Houston is in a vulnerable spot related to its economic activity because of its share of its economy that's tied to energy. So Houston is going to be a little more vulnerable to drops in housing and continued increases in job loss. But San Antonio is the most resistant city in the country for the recession impacts, which is due to its portion of its economy that's tied to technology. Now, San Antonio is also a little bit vulnerable because of the share of its economy that's tied to leisure and hospitality, the Fiesta Texas, SeaWorld, the tourism industry is a little heavier in San Antonio than it is in some of the other regions in Texas. So we do believe this inventory supply is going to be good news for the home builders. And it's going to be good for school districts because it's going to be a supply of homes that families are going to be able to move into. Now, looking specifically by school district at that inventory, now keep in mind their annual start rates are about 2,300 to 2,800 for Prosper, and the inventory is right at 1,376. So literally half of the annual start rate usually starts in the first quarter. It's as those builders really ramp up to try to hit a summer closing. Most families try to time their moves to take place over the summer. So we do believe that most of the school districts that have been experiencing enrollment growth will continue to experience growth. It may slow just a little bit, but we do not see that there's going to be a reversal in enrollment growth for our fast growth clients. Now, we all want to know how long is this going to last. Now, here's a couple of examples. You can see the dot-com crash. Unemployment went from 4% to 6%, so really a pretty minor recession overall. We saw an increase in unemployment of about 2%. The Great Recession went from about 4.4% unemployment up to about 10% unemployment, and that was about a 5.6% change in the unemployment rate. Now, what we know so far about COVID is that we were at about 3.5% unemployment rate across Texas. It's estimated that it's up to about 16%, which was an increase of about 12.5% increase in the unemployment rate. Now, a majority of those jobs that have been lost, it is anticipated that we will see a pretty significant bounce back when we get out from under the shelter in place and when we get back to some more normal types of working conditions. Now, what's unusual is it wasn't caused by speculation. It wasn't a deterioration in economic activity. It was a sudden shock, more like a natural disaster, but it was global. So it was even greater than a natural disaster. And we should expect it to take some time to reset. Everything is truly unprecedented. We've been bouncing around the thought that it could be a V-shaped recovery, which would have been a drastic drop and a drastic recovery. We no longer think that it's going to be a V-shaped recovery. We are hopeful that it won't be a W recovery. A W recovery would simply mean that we have some return to normalcy, and then we have a second wave of pandemic related to COVID exposure in the fall. So there is some thought that that could be what happens. But more of the people that we talk to believe it's going to be more like a Nike swoosh recovery, which means that it's going to be very slow in the recovery, and it could be anywhere from 16 to 18, 20 months before we get back to some 2019 levels of job growth in our economy. So just some key takeaways, and I'll be ready to answer some questions. School districts have risen to the occasion. I haven't touched on this too much, but the school districts have gone through a tremendous amount of change and have responded in incredible ways to this sudden shift. You know, most school districts were enjoying spring break. They were preparing for, you know, all of the spring activities, and then they had to pivot and immediately integrate virtual learning. And this virtual learning was something that had to be created in less than a week. In some cases, it was a 3 days to a 10-day creation of these virtual platforms. They also had to respond with providing meals and the food service response, which was incredible. The technology transformation that had to happen with the delivery of materials and the delivery of technology to help those students. And I have seen more public support and more pride that has jumped back. Public school districts have received more, I think, news exposure over the last couple of months than at any time that I can remember over the last several years. The fall 2020 will mark the biggest shift in enrollment patterns than at any time in history. We are bracing for some huge transitions that are going to take place this fall. Because what also happens when we see this type of an economic upheaval, when we see unemployment surge, we do tend to see the private school enrollment shift back to public school. So when there is this type of job loss, it will cause private school enrollment to drop, and those families will then move back to public school. So we are expecting a shift from private school. I also think we're going to see some shifts from the charter schools due to the success that the school districts have had in supporting families and supporting kids. So we're expecting a charter school shift. Now, there are a handful of charters that have adapted also quite well, but I think the weaker charters are going to get hit exceptionally hard, and that's where we're going to see some shifts from the weaker charters back to public schools. So this shift will result in changes in mobility patterns, virtual learning, and new work patterns. No doubt work patterns are going to be changing as well. We're going to see more and more workers that are going to be working remotely in the future. The new housing market could be a leading factor in the recovery. So we are hopeful that housing will continue to maintain some momentum. Those millennials are just now entering in their home buying years. In fact, I've got two millennials. I've got a son and his wife that live in the Houston area. They are both preparing to buy a home. So they're looking to buy a home. Our daughter and her husband also looking to buy a home. So the millennials are starting to get into those home buying years. What's going to be unknown is, will they be able to have enough money saved up for those down payments And will they be able to have the confidence to make those decisions while we're in this kind of pandemic period? Educators, school districts are getting very creative in preparing for this next school year. Many of the school districts are having to plan multiple scenarios. So they're looking at different ways to transition in those kids, rolling calendars. How do they handle the social distancing? What is going to be the impact on school bus transportation? What's going to be the impact for the possibility of a COVID return in the fall? So the school districts are creating multiple scenarios. So it's going to be a very dynamic fall when we start back school again in a few months. The pandemic is accelerating some trends. So we are seeing an acceleration of the trends of more work remotely. We're also seeing the acceleration of trending for virtual learning, but we're also seeing the reversal of some trends. A reversal of trend related to the travel industry. It's also a reversal in some trends related to commuting, related to automobile usage. And it's causing some trends to be very complex. And education is one of those trends that's going to be very complex. We're seeing this at the collegiate level. We're also going to be seeing this at the K-12 level as well. I do believe we are likely at the dawn of a new era for public education. And 2020, was this new decade, and likely it's going to be a new decade for education. Now, I know I went through that pretty quickly. So Jordan, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you can fire my way.
Great, thank you, Bob. Sangeetha, are you still with us?
Yes.
Great. I'll hand it to you to start questions after. Just want to say thanks again, Bob, for a great presentation and really focusing on, I think, what we're all watching with eager eyes, anxious eyes on what's going to happen. So thanks for the information and being willing to share all this with our organization.
You're welcome.
All right, Bob, I have one question for you from Diego. He's asking about the impact of the economic downturn on the upcoming bond elections and the bonding capacity for school districts.
Wow, that's a great question. We've got several clients that this was a real blow for them to not be able to have their bond election this past May. One of those is Northwest ISD. Northwest ISD, was building at about 1,500 new homes a year. So even with the slowdown, they're still going to be growing at a very strong rate. So the pushing back of that bond election does have a significant consequence for Northwest ISD. And I suspect many of other clients were in a very similar situation to where their growth was so fast and so strong that the pushing back of the bond election is going to cause some facility strains, or it's going to cause some utilization challenges that will likely cause them to have to use portable buildings or to get very creative with utilizing those buildings. Now, on the property value side, so far we are not seeing this has not turned into a financial crisis. So we've seen a huge amount of job loss, but right now the mortgage institutions are offering forbearance on those mortgage payments, which simply means they're pushing back those mortgage payments. And that's likely going to help us to not see a huge spike in foreclosures. Foreclosures are what tend to cause property values to drop the fastest. So if we can avoid a financial crisis and stave off those foreclosures, then we should see districts' property values stay very healthy, which then should continue to help them related to debt capacity and bond elections. Now, those lenders likely can only offer forbearance for about 2 to 3 months. So it's going to be critical that we come out of this shelter in place, this restricted work environment within the next couple of months.
Thank you, Bob. That's all the questions that I see right now. So if anybody else has any other follow-up questions, feel free to put it in the chat box, and I'll be happy to pass that on to Bob. We'll just
You know, one of the key things too that I think is going to be great or that is a quality about our country is that we are very resilient, and the science and technology, the research going into creating vaccines and drugs to help with recovery is accelerating at an incredible rate. And just news about a vaccine has positive impacts on the economy. And so, you know, I'm hopeful that we can continue to advance on the vaccine rates and the drugs there, which once those get available, then we will see a very drastic return to normal, because that's going to provide the confidence that a lot of families need to be able to get back out into public, to begin to attend sporting events. And so I'm optimistic that we're going to see that happen this fall.
Thanks, Bob. There's one more question, and Jordan, this might be in your wheelhouse.
Sure.
Would we be able to figure out how many folks attended this presentation?
Yeah, we had about 40 people attend the presentation today. So I think it was great representation. And obviously, I shared earlier, this presentation was recorded. And so we hope to get that on the website soon, so people can have access to the information Bob presented today.
Okay, great. I've got one more question for you, Bob. With the birth rates declining, what do you think the student growth rate looks like in the next 10 years in North Texas?
Well, luckily for North Texas, we are such a strong job growth area that we are continuing to see, you know, migration coming in. So that's going to be good for the DFW and Austin areas. So the job growth is going to cause population growth, but overall, this is causing some challenges with population growth. And, you know, it's kind of good news, bad news in that, you know, we see all-time low teenage pregnancy rates. We see which, you know, the birth rate is actually a little less than 2 per couple. And that is creating some real challenges long-term for the workforce population. Right now, you know, the boomers are still making up a pretty significant share of the workforce, but long-term, we are going to run into some challenges with workforce numbers just because the birth rate is slowing down so much. So enrollment in Texas has seen some decline in the rate of growth, and that was tied to the birth rate drop. But I think Texas is going to be a continued, you know, strong growth state just because of our business climate. The business culture is so strong in Texas that is causing major businesses to want to relocate to Texas. I mean, we just heard Tesla, you know, he was talking about moving once he ran into some challenges in California, you know, and Texas was one of those potential landing spots. So I do think Texas is going to continue to be the growth state for the next, you know, 10 to 15 years.
Okay. I do have another question. Did the home builders have the same enthusiasm level in 07, 08 that they're currently having, i.e. sticking to 80% of their plan?
No, not at all. In fact, back in the Great Recession, that confidence dropped dramatically because that recession was tied to the housing market. So it was a housing market crash that was a combination of overconfidence from builders, but it was a finance problem because the finance institutions were very creative in their lending to the adjustable rate mortgages. Substandard lending was a key problem. So it was a financial crisis that then caused a huge shock to the home building community. So this is a little different right now because the builders are pretty healthy, And we're seeing another little subtle trend that I didn't mention. Builders are building a higher number of single family home communities that are for rent communities. So, you know, they're building neighborhoods that are kind of like horizontal apartment complexes that those single family homes will never be for sale. They're intended to be permanently for rent homes. So there's a significant amount of building activity that is headed in that direction right now.
So Bob, I actually have a question, a follow-up question. Why do you think that the for rent communities have gained popularity right now?
Well, I do think it's partially tied to the millennials having a lack of money to make those down payments or to qualify for those homes. So therefore, the builder community is responding by providing those options. Now, also, this ties a little bit to the Great Recession. So when the Great Recession happened, we had a natural supply of for rent homes. So the bulk of the homes that, or a large share of homes that were built and were foreclosed on following the Great Recession turned into single family rental homes. Well, in the last several years, there hasn't been a spike in foreclosures to create those single family for rent homes. So the builders are responding by building single family for rent. So I think it's partially just a response from the builders recognizing an opportunity to fill a need because of the lack of for rent homes. It's kind of a roundabout way to answer that question.
No, that was good. Wayne wants to pass his kudos on to everyone that helped organize the presentation. So thank you, Bob, for the excellent presentation. Jordan, it's 1 o'clock. I wanted to see if you wanted to give everybody a couple of minutes. That's all the questions we have.
Yeah, I'd like to. I think it's a good idea if others, take a few more minutes to ask your questions. But Bob, I had one. Just curious for you to talk a little bit more about. You talked about property tax values, but obviously for our educational clients that are on the call, and for those of us that watch that closely, what are the bond interest rates doing right now, and what do you foresee? Obviously, is good for the districts to be aware of and to track, and will we see that? Will we see districts trying to take advantage of that through districts that haven't been able to sell bonds because property tax values are low? Are they getting creative and trying to figure out ways to take advantage of the lower rates that are out there now? Just talk about that holistically.
Well, that's a great question. I might want to defer to some of our financial experts on that, but my sense is that the property values are going to hold for this cycle. Where I think we're going to be vulnerable on some drops in property values would be in the next year. So in 2021, I just got my property bill and it was up. And now, a lot of the values were pretty much already established before the pandemic hit. Mm-hmm. So I do think that the appraisal districts we could see a drop in or not necessarily a drop in value, but just that they won't continue to increase. Most property values over the last 7 to 10 years, have been incrementally going up each year. Every year, property values have been going up in Texas. And I think this could be the year where we see existing values stay flat. And now some of our clients like, Prosper, Northwest, Denton, they have a tremendous amount of new value that's coming on because of new housing and new commercial, new businesses that are opening. So there is going to be some new value that's going to happen, but I do think the existing values are going to soften and slow, which then could affect those built out districts like Keller, like, HEB school district, all those districts that really don't have a lot of new growth. Their existing values are likely going to soften.
Thank you. And the last question I have is with so many bonds pushing from May. Obviously, a lot of those that track those, they've seen, that the boards have come out and said it's moved to November. Some have moved to May. Some have even said, if a secondary election can be called, that they would like to be on an earlier election. One of the things that we have been curious about is what's that going to do to the capacity of the market. And if, all that work, the need that was there in May is now pushed to November, but it doesn't change those districts that were planning for November bonds and the need that's going to be there. And so what would you, kind of forecast about, what that's going to look like and how it's going to impact our market?
Well, that's a good one. What's challenging is the November election that's coming up will probably be the most contentious election that we've ever seen. And most of the time, districts like to avoid the general election, a presidential election. I think it's going to be different district by district. Some areas that have a younger population, then the general election can actually be helpful because it's going to stimulate those voters for those younger families. Now, areas that don't have as much of a younger population, maybe their population is a little older, that can be a negative, that because then you have voters that are voting that really don't have a stake, or they feel like they don't have a stake, so they don't have a concern and they're not educated about bond elections. So some of the rural areas, the general election can be problematic, but for most suburban areas, I think the general election is not going to be as problematic. And then for them, it's they can't afford to wait to May. So then that puts them too far removed from when they can get those buildings delivered. Now, could it cause a pin up of activity, or could it pin up construction projects, which then make it very competitive and could cause an increase in prices and in cost? Certainly could, but I think as long as we're still in this quasi-recessionary environment, we may see some actual more competition amongst the bidders, and we could see a little bit of a softening over the next several months in those prices. I think that'd be a great discussion for your audience and for your members to kind of get an idea of what they're seeing on bids now. Could be that we're seeing a little bit of soften there.
Yeah, I fully agree, Bob. That we actually talked about that in our board meeting, and are hoping to bring back a construction cost program sometime this fall, because we do think, right, there's a lot of questions about what the market's going to do, and so be on the lookout, those that are still on, for that this coming fall.
Go ahead,
Bob.
I was going to say one other thing that we've seen that is kind of good news, in some way, because of this emptying of the buildings. We've had several clients that have accelerated construction projects that were renovations or expansions. And so they have jumped on this opportunity to have a prolonged summer to get these construction projects finished that normally they were going to spread out over 2 different summers. Mm-hmm. They've decided to try to do all of it this summer.
Yep, absolutely. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up. To be respectful of everybody's time, Bob, thanks again for your expertise and knowledge sharing with us today. To the members and our audience, thanks again for bearing with us at the beginning to get our technical difficulties worked out. Again, we'll work to get this posted to the website here, sometime towards the end of the week. And I just want to say thanks for hanging with us through these crazy times. As an organization, we're continuing to look for ways that we can bring value to each of you, and continue to work together to keep all well and safe and keep our industry in a good spot. So thanks again for joining us, and stay safe out there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye now.